Morning has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Pray for the singing, pray for the morning, praise for the springing, fresh from the world. Sweet the rain's new fall, Sunday from heaven, like the first dew fall on the first grass. Praise for the sweetness of the wet garden, sprung in the greenness where his feet pass. Mine is the sunlight, mine is the morning, born of the one light, Eden saw play. Praise living nation, praise every morning, God's recreation of the new day. Morning has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for the springing, fresh from the world.
Well, this morning's worship service will focus on the proposed new 8th UU principle. See, this is a period of discernment for our denomination and for our congregation about whether we wish to formally adopt the new 8th principle to add to our existing 7 principles. Many UU congregations across the country have already adopted the 8th principle in their congregation. The 8th principle reads, "We covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions." Members of our FPUU Anti-Racism Task Force will be sharing an 8th principle moment over the next several Sundays. Each 8th principle moment will focus on one of the key phrases within the 8th principle so that we might have a greater understanding of the overall meaning. So this morning, I would invite Jeanette Rule to share our first 8th principle moment.
We just heard the recitation of the 8th principle, and now I will reflect on the first key phrase. I invite you to do your own reflection. Today's key phrase is journeying toward. Going on a journey or journeying always means moving towards something in some way, with some kind of direction. A journey involves the action, the process, the work, effort, excitement, and discovery along the way toward a destination. Getting to the destination is not necessarily a given, but moving toward it is. Striving for justice and liberty through anti-racism and anti-oppression work is an ongoing journey. What does journeying toward mean to you? How might the eighth principle be part of your journey and our journey together?
I'd like to begin by sharing with you a story. Many, many years ago, there was a small church in a small town, a small church not unlike this one, in fact. Well, one Sunday during the worship service, while the pastor was giving a sermon, a cat found its way into the sanctuary. During the sermon, the cat was meowing and crying and screeching, and the pastor grew more and more irritated. Well, the next Sunday, the same cat came into the sanctuary and continued to screech and moan and whine. Well, finally, the pastor stormed out of the pulpit, grabbed the annoying cat by the scruff of its neck, found some rope that he turned into a long leash, and tied that cat to the tree outside so it would stay out of the sanctuary. Well, from then on, every Sunday, all of the parishioners would walk by the cat tied up in front of the church, and they'd smile as they remembered the disruption earlier in the year. The pastor was relieved. The problem was solved. No more interruptions. Well, even though the congregation would make sure that there was some food and water by the tree, eventually, of course, after many years, the cat died. So, of course, the congregants had to get another cat to replace the dead one because, well, tradition. What is a church without a tied-up cat out front? Well, many years after that, the pastor died, and then a new pastor came. Eventually, the new cat grew old and died as well, and was immediately replaced with, yes, another cat. Generations later, many pastors and many, many cats later, a young minister was called to the church. He saw this strange sight of this tied-up cat in front of the church, so he cut the rope, and he took the cat into the parsonage to live with him. The cat and the pastor were quite pleased with this new arrangement. Well, the next Sunday, as the worship service was about to begin, the congregation was clearly unsettled. Eventually, a few members popped up in their pews and cried, "Stop! We can't start the service." "Why not?" asked the young pastor. "Because there is no cat tied up in front of the church. The end. Tradition. We love tradition, don't we? Especially on Sundays. You know, we love things that are comfortable, things that we can rely on. We love rituals and hymns and stories that root us to the past and ground us in the present. You know, given enough time and repetition, just about anything can become tradition. Some of our traditions are powerful and meaningful, like, for example, our water ceremony we do each September at our in-gathering worship service. Some other traditions can seem cruel and mean, like tying a cat to a tree. You know, instead of feeding and nurturing that noisy cat, who was probably starving, the pastors for generations chose to put that cat into bondage. You know, one tradition that is quite hard for Unitarian Universalists to acknowledge is the tradition of racism found within our faith and within our history. I mean, this congregation here in Medfield had slave-owning ministers, such as the Reverend Baxter, who served here from 1647 to 1745. Sure, we may find the easier way out and justify this by saying, well, that was a long time ago and the world was quite different then. Well, yes, that is true. You know, but a quick look at our history as UUs will show a problematic past in regard to racism, a past that continues to inform our present, and if we're not careful, will inform our future. For example, in the mid-19th century, right here in Boston, the Unitarians in this area, they were an elite class. They were highly educated, white people by and large, who had power, money, and a lot of influence. They were called the Boston Brahmins. People of color in our faith at that time were few and far between because the dominant white culture wished to remain dominant, and they had the power to do so. At the beginning of the 20th century, many Unitarians became fascinated with this new science, this new cutting-edge science known as eugenics. See, this science would allow them the opportunity to make the world in their image, to what they thought it should be, to make everyone more like them. As Reverend Mark Harris describes in his book, Elite, positive eugenics urged healthy white couples to have more babies. The birth rate for upper middle class white women had declined, and this movement encouraged these women to become, quote, good breeders. Negative eugenics, on the other hand, tried to assert that those who were not worthy to have babies should be discouraged and even prevented from doing so. Yes, shockingly, Unitarians were early proponents of eugenics, well before when Hitler and the Nazis took this science to its most horrific conclusion. Well, several decades later, in 1965, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called on people of conscience to join him for a demonstration in Selma, Alabama, to protest that egregious racism found there, it provided this unique opportunity for UUs. Reverend Mark Morrison Reed tells us in his book, Selma Awakening, for Unitarian Universalists, Selma was a test. See, UUs like to emphasize integration, and yet it is difficult to find a passage of their writings or speeches in which integration doesn't really mean assimilation. See, there's no evidence that white UUs grasped that intention meant genuine systemic change rather than simply assimilation. A few years later, in 1967, there was the first National Conference of Black Unitarian Universalists in Chicago. They were demanding progressive change and equal rights for black people. Many black UUs of the late 60s were not satisfied with the tepid level of commitment shown by our Unitarian Universalist Association. And this lack of commitments led to many of our black members leaving the faith, many for good. For at the end of the day, what good are progressive principles if you're not willing to put them into action? If you personally, as we white people do, have no actual skin in the game, it's easy to turn a blind eye. And that's sadly what has happened in our history over and over again. In the late 1980s and 90s, we were pretty silent on issues of race. Then more recently, there was a decade of what seemed like progress. Many congregations embraced the Black Lives Matter movement and displayed banners on their buildings, like we do here in Medfield. A few years ago, you may have remembered hearing about a high-profile crisis. It's a crisis over the lack of inclusivity in hiring practices at the UUA. Well, it led to the resignation of our former UUA president, Reverend Peter Morales, as well as some other key leaders. For years, our UU siblings of color, those who refuse to give up on this faith that they love, have been telling us that we still have a long way to go to becoming truly welcoming to people of color, who still face inadvertent and sometimes even blatant racism when they walk through our doors. Hearing all of this, I imagine some of you might be feeling a bit defensive, a bit uncomfortable. That's completely normal. You might be thinking, but we're not racist here in Medfield. We would gladly welcome people of color. Or maybe you are wondering, Medfield and the surrounding towns have so few people of color. Why do we even need to address issues of race? Why do we need to talk about race when we're all just white people? I'm certainly not racist. Are you calling me racist? Sure, yes, we may not be racist personally. But the question is, are we anti-racist? Meaning, are we actively working to dismantle this racist system that benefits us white folks and harms people of color? Being anti-racist is a verb. For First Parish Medfield still has a tradition of a dominant culture being in positions of power in our congregation. Those who are white, wealthy, straight, cisgender, male, and highly educated. Look at me as your new pastor. I check all of those boxes, as does my predecessor, as does the chair of the executive committee, as does the chair before that. And the trouble is, when there are no people of color in the room, it is so much harder to make these cultural changes towards building that multicultural, diverse community. It's hard to advocate for changes to a future we don't see yet. It's hard to know how to be welcoming to people who have not yet come through our doors. But yet, our progressive faith calls us to do just that. A comprehensive report was completed between the years 2017 and 2020 entitled Widening the Circle of Concern. This report was spearheaded by our former UUA co-presidents, Reverend Sophia Betancourt, Reverend Bill Sinkford, and Dr. Leon Spencer. They were tasked with an enormous responsibility of gathering data from our congregations, about how we might move toward truly, finally, building a faith that is multicultural, diverse, and inclusive. Well, in the reports, they gathered testimonials from many people in many congregations. And having read it, I was amazed that several UUs of color reported commonly experiencing microaggressions that they experienced in coffee hour, in meetings, and in other UU spaces. Our siblings of color reported receiving comments and questions such as, and I quote, "Tell me, where are you really from? You speak English so well. Welcome. As a person of color, do you want to join our racial justice team? Oh, I just have to touch your child's hair." They report having experience such as, quote, "During a board meeting at the district level, a minister made a joke about me being 4/5 of a person. No one challenged him. They all laughed." Or, quote, "The number of times white people clutched their purses closer when I sat next to them at General Assembly." This is happening now in our congregations. I know all of this is cringeworthy, but these are real people sharing real experiences. And we would be wise to listen, to take them seriously, even if we're feeling defensive. But clearly we have a problem centuries in the making. Our siblings of color deserve better, and it's clear we have work to do. Which leads us to the 8th UU principle. Last weekend I was at a workshop led by Paula Cole-Jones, one of the co-creators of the 8th principle. She told this story of a man who had made a comment that summed up what has long been the culture of many of our UU congregations. He said that when visitors come to their church, the message is, "You are welcome here, as long as you fit in." And I wonder, here in Medfield, we're being completely honest with ourselves. So deep down, do we believe something similar? We'll welcome anyone, as long as you fit in. The Black Lives of UU Organizing Collective is urging congregations to adopt this 8th principle. And so far, 44 congregations have already done so across the country. And that number, I was told, will easily double by this June after the annual meetings in various congregations vote on it. They are calling on congregations to articulate a commitment to dismantling racism and other oppressions. Then the timeline goes at General Assembly in June of 2022, over a year from now, our entire denomination, our entire UU denomination, will vote on whether or not to adopt the 8th principle. I read the 8th principle at the beginning of the service, but let me read it again. "We covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions." It is a mouthful. And you might wonder, why should we change our beloved principles? Why adopt this new principle? What does it offer our movements in the world that the other principles don't? Well, first of all, our 7 principles have always been a work in progress. They are not immutable. They are not unchanging. I know it's easy to think they are because they've been around for a while, but they are not like the 10 Commandments, that there'll always be 10, there always was 10, always will be. As religious people, we believe in this idea of ongoing revelation. See, as we unfold new truths, we incorporate them into our learning. We grow, we change. These new truths might be facts, but perhaps more importantly, they are also ways of being. of people's experiences and identities, affirming that open revelation, makes space for new people, for new voices, and new perspectives that are coming in to Unitarian Universalism. That might be the perspectives of young adults, or people who are differently abled, trans people, those of Muslim, Jewish, or Hindu backgrounds, people of color, people of different socioeconomic backgrounds. And in order for those who are part of our movement to experience true belonging, their voices and experiences need to be heard and included. That openness to revelation means being willing to change our hearts and our minds. And, my friends, our principles, which help to shape the future of who we are as a faith. That's what's happened in the past, if you weren't aware. Our current 7 principles grew out of professions of faith and statements of purpose that predated the 1961 merger of Unitarians and Universalists. And over the years since, they were revised, first in 1984 and in 1985, and then they were amended again in 1995. The reformulated principles were largely the result of the work of UU women. The women were unhappy with blatant sexist language in the original version. There were references to, quote, the dignity of man and mankind, for example. The women critiqued Unitarian Universalism for being patriarchal, an idea that proved hard for some UUs to accept. My mom, as a UU minister for 30 years, raised me with these ideals, and she was there in the 80s trying to make this change. Not everyone understood at the time that the masculine language excluded women and reinforced the patriarchy. But ultimately, the principles were altered to be more inclusive, to widen our welcome. Another reason, as I see it, to add this principle is that many of our congregations are starved for what the 8th principle has to offer. Many of us are hungry for a principle that speaks to our spiritual longing to build that beloved community and to have some mechanism to hold ourselves and each other accountable to creating a diverse, multicultural space. It doesn't really seem like we should need this principle at all, does it? The values are implicit in the other 7 principles. The reality is that those 7 principles haven't helped to make nearly enough progress in dismantling racism and other oppressions and in building beloved community. The other 7 principles do not explicitly express the ethical and spiritual thread that we need to live into a multicultural, anti-racist vision for our religious communities and our world. Otherwise, we would have already made this progress. We need a common language, a common understanding, and an ethical framework that we can collectively point to and to hold ourselves and each other accountable to. Adopting the 8th principle is a starting point. It's a journey. It's a starting point toward being accountable toward these goals, accountable to all those marginalized voices, all those who continue to be harmed by our careless and hurtful comments, harmed by our exclusionary dominant cultures. The 8th principle would help us renew our commitment to fulfill the potential of the existing 7 principles. Another reason to adopt this new principle is because love is central to our faith. It's a hallmark of universalism in particular. That's where we get this idea that God is love. Yet it's nowhere to be found in our principles. The word love is not mentioned even in our 7 principles. Sure, the word compassion is, so is community. There are lots of references to values that would ideally promote love, but still the word love is not there. The phrase beloved community would encapsulate that call to love. The term beloved community was coined in the 20th century by the philosopher Josiah Royce. See, he was a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the largest interfaith peace organization in the country. And the term was made popular, of course, by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s. The Black Lives of UU Organizing Collective describes beloved community this way. Quote, beloved community happens when people of diverse racial, ethnic, educational, class, gender, sexual orientation backgrounds, and identities come together in an interdependent relationship of love, of mutual respect, and care. One that seeks to realize justice within the community and the broader world. Another reason for us to adopt the 8th principle is a growing awareness that we have not reached the goal of this beloved community. We have not reached a critical level of consciousness in becoming multicultural, anti-racist, and anti-oppression. This is the work to be done. This is our work to be done now. To get into right relationship and actually getting to know one another across our differences. For we have not succeeded in coming together in the ways that the beloved community calls us to do. Too often we've faltered in this work, both here in our congregations and out in the larger world. Black Lives of UU Organizing Collective is calling on congregations to adopt this principle. Not because any of us have arrived at the goal of beloved community, but because we need to renew our efforts and have a strong starting point to move us toward, to have us journey toward that goal. W.E.B. Du Bois famously said, now is the accepted time, not tomorrow, not some more convenient season. It is today. It is today that our best work can be done, and not some future day or future year. Friends, now is the time to dismantle racism, not some future time. Now is the time when we need this beloved community, not some future time. Now is the time to journey towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community. Now is the time to say, you are welcome here with all that you are. Now is the time to go outside in front of that church, to that tree where that cat has been tied up for generations, and to cut those ropes of oppression. Now is the time. Now's the time for the 8th principle. May it be so. Amen.